Let me start with something that should bother you. For nearly 700 years, the ancient world had access to a single plant, one plant, that physicians, traders, generals, and emperors described as capable of treating fevers, infections, digestive ailments, chronic pain, and conditions we still struggle with today. Silphium. A plant so medically valuable that the city built around its trade became one of the wealthiest in the ancient Mediterranean. A plant so culturally significant that it was minted onto coins, carved into temple walls, and catalogued by the greatest naturalists of the classical world. And then it was gone. Not dormant, not relocated, not transformed into something else under a different name. Gone, extinct, vanished from the earth within a generation and, remarkably, within the same historical window that saw the consolidation of medical practice under centralized Roman authority. That's the official story. Overgrazing, they say, agricultural mismanagement, the natural consequence of unchecked demand. But the deeper I looked into what silphium actually was, what it was used for, who controlled it, who documented it, and most critically, who didn't, the more that explanation began to feel not just incomplete, but almost deliberately thin. Silphium, Ferula tingitana, or perhaps a related species in the giant fennel family, the botanists still argue. It grew in a narrow coastal strip of what is now northeastern Libya, in the ancient Greek colony of Cyrene. And here's the first thing that should catch your attention. It grew only there. Nowhere else in the world. A plant of extraordinary medical and culinary value, and it existed in precisely one location on Earth. Does that strike you as merely inconvenient, or does it strike you as something else entirely? The Greeks called it the gift of Apollo. Hippocrates, the father of medicine himself, referenced it in his writings. Dioscorides, whose Materia Medica remained the foundational text of European pharmacy for 15 centuries, catalogued it with obvious reverence. Pliny the Elder, Rome's great encyclopedist of natural knowledge, mourned its passing with the kind of grief normally reserved for the death of emperors. He wrote that by his time, the 1st century AD, only a single stalk of silphium had been found, and it was sent directly to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. A single stalk sent to an emperor, not to a physician, not to a botanical garden, not to a library or an academy of natural science, to Nero. I want you to hold that detail. We'll return to it. What exactly did silphium treat? That's where the ancient record becomes both staggering and suspicious. Fevers, infections, sore throats, digestive disorders, skin conditions, menstrual irregularities, coughs, pain, warts, dog bites, scorpion stings. The juice of its stalk, the resin called laser or lasopicium, was described as effective for an astonishing range of conditions. Ancient writers weren't vague about this. They were specific, technical, almost clinical in their descriptions of dosages, preparations, and outcomes. And then, silence. Not a gradual diminishment of references, not a slow scholarly debate about declining efficacy. The references simply stop. The plant vanishes from medical literature at roughly the same time. It vanishes from physical existence. And what I find most arresting isn't the disappearance itself, it's the uniformity of it. Across cultures, across languages, across centuries of accumulated botanical and medical knowledge, the record of silphium's therapeutic properties becomes fragmentary, inconsistent, and in critical areas, inexplicably absent. If you find this kind of investigation compelling, the places where official history develops strange, convenient holes, consider becoming a YouTube member, as the algorithm tends to not approve of topics like these. We're just getting started. The ancient world produced extraordinary botanical catalogues. The Egyptians maintained detailed medical papyri. The Greeks had their rhizotomists, professional root cutters, and plant specialists who spent their lives studying medicinal herbs. The Romans established systematic agricultural and pharmaceutical traditions that survived in various forms for 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire. And yet, the precise biochemical properties of the most celebrated medicinal plant in classical antiquity, the one mounted on coins referenced by every major medical authority of the ancient world, traded across the entire Mediterranean basin, were never definitively recorded, preserved, or passed on in any reproducible form. Not in Alexandria, not in Rome, not in Byzantium, which preserved enormous quantities of classical knowledge through the medieval period. That's not an oversight, that's a pattern. And here is where, for me, the investigation shifted from curiosity to something more urgent, because silphium is not alone. The more I examined the history of lost botanical medicine, the more I encountered what I can only describe as a recurring template. A valuable plant or compound, one with broad-spectrum therapeutic applications, achieves widespread use across a civilization. Its properties are documented by credible, respected authorities, and then within a historically compressed time frame, the plant disappears, the documentation becomes fragmented, the knowledge of its preparation is lost, and the medical tradition that relied upon it is either absorbed into a more centralized system or simply abandoned. Theriac. The great antidote of antiquity, whose full formula, containing anywhere from 40 to 80 plus ingredients, was prepared according to recipes that varied so dramatically between sources that historians today cannot reconstruct a single definitive version. A preparation used by Roman emperors as a universal remedy, whose knowledge fragmented so completely after the classical period that the compound became more legend than medicine. Soma. The sacred healing and consciousness expanding plant of the Vedic tradition, referenced throughout the Rig Veda as both a medical and spiritual substance of supreme importance. Its identity is one of the most contested questions in the history of botany. Dozens of candidates proposed, none definitively confirmed, the original knowledge seemingly evaporated from a civilization that documented almost everything else with extraordinary care. Kaifi. The Egyptian sacred compound burned in temples and used therapeutically, whose preparation involved dozens of ingredients, careful ritual timing, and specialized knowledge held by a priestly class, knowledge that disappeared with the suppression of the Egyptian temple traditions, leaving us with ingredient lists, but no functional preparation method. Not this plant, not that preparation, not some edge case botanical curiosity, but the same pattern, expressed across different civilizations, different time periods, different cultural contexts. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let's return to the physical record, because there's something in the archaeology that the official narrative handles very gently, almost carefully, and I think deserves harder scrutiny. Cyrene, the city whose entire economic and cultural identity was built around silphium, was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Its ruins survive in modern Libya, temples, public buildings, elaborate necropolies. The city was wealthy enough, and the silphium trade was valuable enough, that Cyrene operated with a degree of economic independence remarkable for a Greek colony of its size. It issued its own high-quality coinage. It maintained its own philosophical and medical traditions. It had, effectively, a monopoly on the most medically significant substance in the ancient world, and the Romans wanted it. The kingdom of Cyrene was bequeathed to Rome in 96 BC through a will according to official history. The last Ptolemaic ruler simply left his kingdom to Rome upon his death. No war, no conquest, no negotiation, just a will. I'm not suggesting that document was forged. I'm asking you to note that it was convenient. Very, very convenient. By the time Rome absorbed Cyrene, the silphium trade was already allegedly in decline. But here's the anomaly that I simply cannot reconcile with the agricultural mismanagement thesis. The Romans were extraordinary agricultural administrators. They understood rotation, soil management, controlled harvesting, botanical preservation. They maintained estates that produced the same crops across multiple generations. They were not, by any serious historical assessment, careless stewards of economically valuable resources. And yet, despite having every motivation to preserve the most valuable medicinal crop in their newly acquired territory, the silphium simply died out. Within roughly a century of Roman control, the official explanation collapses here. Not completely, not provably, but it buckles under the weight of that specific detail. The Romans could have preserved it. The Romans had preserved other valuable botanicals. The Romans had in fact developed sophisticated systems for exactly this kind of agricultural conservation, but not this plant. This one they let go. This is where the investigation becomes difficult to explain away. Imagine trying to erase knowledge of a plant. Not the plant itself, the knowledge, the preparation methods, the dosage specifics, the compound formulations that combine silphium's laser resin with other ingredients to produce targeted therapeutic effects. That knowledge didn't live in one place. It lived in Alexandria, in Rome, in Athens, in Carthage, in the trading ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, in the hands of travelling physicians, root cutters and apothecaries across a vast and interconnected ancient world. For that knowledge to vanish as completely as it did would require a coordination so extraordinary, so simultaneous, so comprehensive, that it becomes almost impossible to attribute to accident or simple neglect. Think about what it would take. Every botanical garden, every medical school, every travelling physician's personal notes, every apothecary's handbook, every monastic library that preserved classical texts, every translation effort that carried Greek and Roman knowledge through the medieval period and into the Renaissance. All of them would need to have, at precisely the same moment, either lost or chosen not to preserve the functional therapeutic knowledge of this one plant. That's not negligence. That's a wall that appears, remarkably, exactly where our most useful knowledge should be. Once you notice that, you cannot unnotice it. And here's the strangest part. The name survived. The reverence survived. The cultural memory of silphium's importance survived clearly enough that Pliny could mourn it, that medieval scholars could reference the ancient testimonials, that we today can reconstruct a surprisingly detailed catalogue of what the plant supposedly did. What didn't survive was the how, the preparation methods, the compound formulations, the clinical specifics. The use was preserved, the utility was erased. That's a very specific and very unusual kind of forgetting. I want to move now to something more speculative, but follow me, because the pattern holds. The tradition of herbal and compound medicine that silphium represented didn't die with the plant, it transformed. Or rather, it was transformed. What had been a broadly accessible trade-based system of botanical medicine, where the healing substance was a physical plant available to merchants, physicians and private citizens across the Mediterranean, became over the subsequent centuries something increasingly esoteric, increasingly fragmented, and increasingly dependent on specialized, restricted knowledge. The alchemical tradition that emerged in Alexandria in the early centuries of the Common Era occupies a fascinating position in this story. Here were scholars attempting to recover, reconstruct and theorize about natural transformation processes, including medicinal processes, working often from incomplete, encoded or deliberately obscured source materials. The great alchemical texts are full of the language of loss, recovered knowledge, hidden teachings, encrypted wisdom from a prior age. Why would knowledge need to be hidden? What were they encoding, and from whom? The Arabic alchemical tradition that followed, and which preserved enormous quantities of Greek medical and philosophical knowledge that would otherwise have vanished, similarly speaks in the language of transmission, recovery, and hidden lineage. Ibn Sina, Jabir ibn Hayyan, these were not charlatans or mystics. They were serious scholars conducting what they understood to be empirical natural research, and they worked consistently from the sense that something had been lost that they were trying to reconstruct. The evidence suggests something much larger was at stake than the loss of one plant. It suggests the loss of an entire system, a way of approaching the natural world as a source of healing that was comprehensive, integrated, and, perhaps critically, decentralized. Not controlled, not regulated, not dependent on any central authority for its production, its distribution, or its knowledge base. That distinction between decentralized natural medicine and centralized, controlled medical practice is the thread that, once you pick it up, unravels through all of this history. Let me tell you what's missing. Not what we have, what we don't have. We don't have a single, complete, clinically precise account of silphium's preparation for internal use. We don't have reproducible compound formulas that specify the laser resin in combination with other ingredients at functional dosages. We don't have any preserved biological material, no seeds, no root samples, no dried plant specimens, despite the fact that the Romans, the Byzantines, and later the Islamic scholars of the medieval period preserved botanical specimens of far less celebrated plants. We don't have, and this is the detail I keep returning to, any account of anyone trying to cultivate silphium outside its native range. Ancient agriculture was sophisticated enough to transplant, cultivate, and acclimatize plants across vast distances. The Romans moved species across their empire constantly. The idea that no one at any point during the centuries of silphium's documented therapeutic value attempted systematic cultivation of a plant worth its weight in silver in controlled agricultural conditions, in locations protected from the wild grazing allegedly responsible for its decline, this strains credibility almost to breaking. The silence in the record here is not the silence of absence, it's the silence of removal. Those are different silences, and once you've learned to distinguish them, you start hearing the second kind everywhere. And what filled the space? This is the question that the official history never asks with sufficient seriousness. Because when a system disappears, medical, economic, cultural, something moves into the vacuum. And the nature of what moves in tells you something about the nature of what was displaced. After silphium, after the fracturing of the classical botanical tradition, after the deliberate encoding and restriction of the alchemical knowledge streams, what emerged slowly and then with gathering force was a medical system organized around scarcity, around proprietary formulations, around specialized credentialed practitioners whose authority derived not from independent mastery of natural knowledge but from institutional certification, around, in other words, control. I am not saying this is entirely bad. I'm not making that claim. Regulation, standardization, and credentialing have genuine value. Medicine made real and extraordinary advances under systematized practice. But I am asking, what was the cost? What did we trade when we moved from a world where the most powerful therapeutic substances were plants that grew from the earth, documented by independent scholars across multiple competing traditions, accessible in principle to any person with the knowledge to use them, to a world where that knowledge is fragmented, restricted, credentialed, and controlled? And I am asking whether that trade was entirely natural, whether it happened entirely by accident, whether the specific, targeted, comprehensive erasure of the most powerful nodes of decentralized healing knowledge, silphium, soma, theriac, kyphi, the great compound formulations of the ancient world, whether all of that represents a series of unrelated agricultural and cultural accidents, or whether it represents something that was, in some form, guided. Not by any single hand, not by any single institution I can name, but guided. I want to return one final time to that coin, the silver tetradrachm of Cyrene. On one face, a portrait of the ruling figure, the stamp of political authority. On the other, the silphium plant, rendered in precise botanical detail, the heart-shaped seed at its crown. For the Cyrenians, these two images were equivalent: sovereignty and medicine, political power and healing power, the two faces of a single coin, literally and philosophically. When Rome absorbed Cyrene, the silphium coins gradually disappeared from circulation. New coins appeared. Roman coins carrying Roman authority, Roman iconography, Roman symbols of imperial power. The plant was replaced by the portrait. Healing was absorbed by the state, and the coin, that ancient emblem of the equivalence between political sovereignty and medical sovereignty, that coin became, like the plant itself, an object for collectors, a relic, a curiosity sent to emperors, a beautiful, useless artifact from a world that no longer existed. I don't know what silphium could have done. None of us do, not really. The biochemistry is gone. The clinical record is gone, the plant itself is gone, but I know that something extraordinary existed. Something the ancient world, for all its limitations, recognized as extraordinary, recognized clearly enough to put it on money, to write about it in their most important books, to grieve its loss with genuine anguish. I know that its loss was remarkably complete. I know that the knowledge of its use vanished with a thoroughness that exceeds what we would expect from simple neglect or natural extinction. And I know that the pattern, the template of valuable healing knowledge, disappearing in exactly the ways most useful to those who would prefer healing to be controlled, restricted and centralized, that pattern does not begin or end with silphium. So here is the question I leave you with. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, a question. What if the most important things that were lost, not the buildings, not the art, not the written philosophy and recorded history, but the practical knowledge, the knowledge of how to heal, what if those losses were not the collateral damage of time and chaos? What if they were the point? What would we look like as a civilization if that were true? How would we look different from how we look now? And here's the question that I find most haunting of all, the one I keep returning to in the dark quiet after all the research is closed and the documents are stacked and the anomalies are all noted and nothing is resolved. If someone were to find silphium tomorrow, growing somewhere in the hills above the Libyan coast, surviving against all odds in some sheltered valley where the goats never reach, would we know what to do with it, or would that knowledge too be gone?